I get everybody's attention, please, and please keep eating as we are going to go ahead and get the meeting started so that we can get to our speaker and listen to him. Hopefully everyone enjoyed the morning sessions and the seminars that we had. We had a great speaker earlier this morning at the breakfast, and we're going to have another good one today. So we'll get it started right now and let our chairman, Nick Powell.
Well, I hope you're all enjoying your lunch. I don't know about yours, but mine was very good. The steaks were good. So anyway, my job today is to start out by introducing the head table here. To my right is Marjorie Nagel, who is chairman of the convention this year. She's doing a great job, as I hope you all are enjoying all what we have to offer here. Next to her is Robert Grenier, who is our guest speaker for this luncheon. Of course, you all know Ed Cross. To my far left is Nick Hess, who is co-chair and will be chairing the convention next year, so I'm sure he's taking good notes. And then we have Dwight Keene, who will be making the presentation of the nominating committee. Then I get to introduce the past president's table. Now at the end of my first year as chairman of KIOGA, I have a lot of respect for the gentlemen who have earned their seats at the past chairman's table. And I now know why, after I was elected last year and I had all these members, people coming up and congratulating me, several of the past chairmen came up to me and gave me their condolences. So and that had me a little worried, but anyway. Anyway, when you please hold your applause to the end when I get finished, and if you gentlemen would stand when I call your name. Mark Shreve, Dick Schremer, Alan DeGood, John Callan, Roger McCoy, Dave Davald, Tim Scheck, and Dave Murfin. Thank you. So thank you for all you have done in the past, and many of them are still working hard. In fact, I can tell you most of them are all still working hard for the organization, and so most appreciative of that. I think I'm now supposed to turn this over to Dwight Keene, who is going to give the slate of the officers and directors. Dwight.
Thank you very much, Nick. I want to thank, again, Tim Scheck for allowing me the courtesy of assisting him this year with the nominating process. In a moment of circumspection and introspection, I believe that we could all agree that our time is our most important asset and resource. This afternoon, I have two brief takes on time. The first is 157 days, 11 hours, 14 minutes, and 35 seconds. What is this, you might ask? I think many of you know. It's exactly the amount of time remaining until Barack Obama is no longer president of the United States. With any luck, in 4 months, we won't have to begin another timeline. My other take on time is simply this: a willingness to unselfishly share such a valuable resource with others, to advance an important common purpose, is a most profound means of giving back. And that is precisely what our staff and our officers and directors do on a day-by-day basis. They advance our shared goals and make KIOGA an effective organization. At yesterday's general membership and board of directors meetings, the following individuals were elected to serve for 2 years as KIOGA directors: K. Todd Allen, Jeff Bloomer, Raul F. Brito, Jim Byers, Tom Casey, Steve M. Dillard, Michael W. Dixon, Kelly Edgar, Diana Edmondson, John O. Farmer IV, Jim Farthing, John L. Francis, Mark Gallion, Brian T. Goodrow, Michael Harms, Timothy D. Hellman, Nicholas D. Hess, Richard J. Cole, Andrea Krug Kraus, Robert E. Crable, Doug Lewis, Robert B. McGrath, Michael Piscotti, Gary L. Reed, Mike Reed, Leon Rodak, Daniel F. Shippers, Joe A. Schremer, Trent Sibbets, Paul Simmons, Kim Miller-Sneath, and Gary D. Walker. Again, at yesterday's Board of Directors meeting, the following individuals were elected to serve for 1 year as advisory board members: Thornton E. Anderson and Lee Banks. In addition, the following individuals were elected to serve for 3 years as KIOGA designated trustees to the Kansas Oil and Gas Resources Board: Nick Hess, Tom Casey, and Marjorie Nagel. And in that regard, before I move on to a brief conclusion here, let me thank 2 outgoing members of the Kansas Oil and Gas Resources Board who, over the course of the over 10 years that they've served, basically since the inception of that board, they have contributed substantial time and effort toward making the product of that board as successful as it's become. And those individuals are John Callan and Mark Shreve. Thank you both for all of the efforts you've contributed on our behalf. Finally, at yesterday's board meeting, we elected the following officers: for vice chairman to serve for 2 years, Todd Morgenstern for the Northwest region, and finally, for secretary to serve for 2 years, Bill Anderson. Please join me in thanking each of these persons for their willingness to serve KIOGA. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope that you are finding the convention a valuable benefit. And I just want to say again, thank you for taking the time to be here and your dedication to KIOGA. We greatly appreciate your support. I just want to take a few moments now just to talk about KIOGA and kind of our the state of the industry, not trying to repeat everything that's already been said, but I want to begin by talking about how each of you makes a difference every day for our nation's energy security and economic well-being. That's whether you're a producer, a pumper, a roughneck, a geologist, an engineer, a supplier, or even a lawyer. I see Jeff looking at me there, but you know, you are a crucial part of what makes this nation function efficiently day to day. So without the tasks that each of you complete on your job each day, people would not have the fuel to drive to the grocery stores or to heat their homes in the winter. You're an important part of this industry and to the people's everyday lives. And you are amazing, and I know you don't hear that nearly enough, certainly not in the media, but you need to know that you are amazing and an important part of our economy. Later this year, we'll choose who will lead us in Washington and in Topeka, and those choices will have a lasting and profound impact on the direction of our nation's energy policy. American energy policy is not a Republican issue or a Democrat issue. It's an American prosperity and leadership issue. You know, our industry continues to face many challenges, with our biggest challenges continuing to come from the federal level. And we have powerful enemies that want to severely limit our access to abundant reserves of oil and gas, shut down drilling because of exaggerated issues, and litigate us to death, and unfairly tax and regulate us to the breaking point. And we're straining to adjust to a host of these potentially harmful issues. The challenges we face today have grown both in number and complexity. Those who oppose American energy development at the state and national level use environmental and regulatory issues to disrupt orderly oil and gas development and influence policymakers. And ladies and gentlemen, I don't have to tell anyone in this room that they use these issues not to make energy development better, but to stop or impede oil and gas development. The American people want, expect, and deserve elected leaders who will place what's best for our state and nation's economy and energy future above partisan ideology and political posturing. No longer constrained by electoral considerations, the Obama administration last year appears to be dedicated to furthering an extremist agenda. Insane regulations and executive orders has become a hallmark of the Obama presidency. The good news is that there's been several efforts that have resulted in progress in rolling back some of the political agendas, including the U.S. Supreme Court stay of the EPA's Clean Power Plan, the nationwide stay of the EPA's Waters of the U.S. rule, the vacating of lesser prairie chicken listing, and the Bureau of Land Management hydraulic fracturing rule. But really what all that says is, unfortunately, it seems to take legal action to get this administration to do the right thing. You know, also, when you look at the recent federal tax reform discussions, they put our critical oil and gas tax provisions in play as they prepare for tax reform efforts in 2017. It's critical issues like this is why we must continue to bring home to Americans a better understanding of our industry. Now, I make about 40 or so presentations at public forums each year, and I always encourage folks to listen to the facts when it comes to energy policy discussions and focus on what's important, which is American jobs, American energy security, and American global energy leadership, because energy, and specifically oil and gas, will remain foundational to our way of life. Our underlying message is simple. Oil and gas are fundamental to our modern way of life and high standard of living. Combined, these resources supply more than 60% of the energy that Americans use every day, and moreover, they are the building blocks of thousands of products that makes our lives more comfortable, safer, cleaner, and healthier. The men and women of the oil and gas industry reject the stale mindset of last century's thinking peddled by some that oil and natural gas production and environmental stewardship are not compatible. Yeah, as a matter of fact, when you look at the EPA, just last year they said that the oil and gas sector had reduced methane emissions by 38% since 2005. Yet now they come out and say the oil and gas industry's efforts to reduce methane emissions have not been successful, even though their data shows exactly the opposite. And while the recent drastic drop in oil prices have led to some restructuring in the oil industry, this is not the long-term story or trend for our industry. So our challenge going forward as advocates of this industry is to work hard each and every day to make sure that folks have the access to the best information available. I encourage all of you to communicate with policymakers and the public about why making the right decisions on energy is so important to our nation's energy future. And I have found that when people know more about our industry and energy issues in general, they support policies that include oil and gas. Good communication requires accurate facts and fact-based information, and we continually update our fact sheets and reference material, and you can find those on our website. So going forward, you know, our challenges will continue to come from the federal level, but with over 4,200 members, KIOGA is the lead state and national advocate for the Kansas oil and gas industry. We identify and interpret public policies and regulations that are fundamental to your success. We continually submit comments at the appropriate times in regulatory proposals, and we meet with key policymakers. And we continue to build and work with other groups, including Domestic Energy Producers Alliance, IPAA, and others. And finally, we litigate when necessary. The key to protecting our interests is maintaining pressure in the political process. There's many competing agendas in Washington, and we must maintain constant pressure in that system to position our issues and concerns as key factors in America's economy, foreign policy, and national security. Face-to-face meetings with policymakers are crucial to keep our interests protected. We continually meet with federal policymakers, having met with over 350 of those over the last 7 years. Basically, I provide them information that says when tax and regulatory costs increase more than the real economy, the results are destructive to economic growth. We advocate for rational energy policy, common sense tax policy, and regulatory structure. What we're doing is we're laying a foundation for moving forward when a new administration takes office in 2017. We will continue to occupy the front lines working to protect our nation's oil and gas blessings. Now, I think there's three major success drivers that set KIOGA apart from other oil and gas advocacy groups, and that makes us a lead state national advocate for Kansas independent producers. First success driver is intellectual capital. You know, we have a large pool of expertise and people that have a lot of knowledge in different areas of the oil and gas industry. And then that leads us to our second success driver, which is volunteerism. It's unbelievable in this organization that we have people that will always step up to the plate whenever we need help and often subordinate their own personal gain to help not only the association but the industry as a whole. At yesterday's board meeting, we honored two of KIOGA members who have recently stepped up to the plate and put some time and effort into that. Adam Barron received the KIOGA's President Leadership Award for his efforts in the electric rate issues that are facing independent oil producers and the Electric Power Committee. And Tim Scheck received the KIOGA Outstanding Service Award for his outstanding efforts in putting together some educational seminars and tours for the governor, legislators, and appraisers and other folks around Kansas. The third success driver is leadership. You know, true leaders see a need, envision a plan, and empower stakeholders for action. KIOGA's past chairmen that are sitting right here in front of me, they exemplify great leadership, and they have shown that, and they're always a great example for the next new chairman coming in to look at the leadership they provided this association and this industry. KIOGA's been blessed with many great leaders that have served our industry well. Because in the end, it's not who you were, it's whether you made a difference. And each of these chairmen and our committee chairs and our current chairman, also, they exemplify great leadership, and has made a positive difference for all of us. So I just want to stop right there for a minute so we can give another round of applause to KIOGA's past chairmen, as well as our current chairman and our committee chairs, and everybody who gives the volunteer effort to what KIOGA does. As we look ahead to November elections and beyond, we continue our forward-looking energy policy advocacy efforts to spur better energy policies and make sure that energy policy is based on fact and reality and not ideology and hyperbole. The wrong governmental policy framework generates wrong policy, and that's what we've been seeing in Washington. We're not likely to see significant economic growth until we see a change in basic policy. A new administration could give our economy a quick and substantial boost by encouraging rather than blocking the development of America's vast energy resources. I strongly believe that the American public needs and wants moral, intellectual, and strategic clarity and courage from our policymakers. So in closing, I just want to relate to you a story I shared with media not too long back. A reporter asked me about the Kansas oil and gas industry, what's important to know about the Kansas oil and gas industry. And I told him that the oil and gas industry is an exciting industry where innovation is always a constant. I want people to know how hard the oil and gas industry works on performance and continuous improvement. I've worked in the oil and gas industry now for over 30 years, and I'm always amazed at how the industry never stops thinking about the next innovation or technology that's going to improve our nation's energy security. But most importantly, I want people to know that the oil and gas industry isn't just working hard on what we've learned, but we're working hard on how we can improve in the future. So with that, I'll turn it over to our Convention Committee Chair, Marjorie Nagel.
Thank you, Ed. At this time, I would like to thank and honor the members of the Convention Committee. First of all, there's Nick Hess, who has been my co-chair throughout this process, and Steve Anderson of Mull, as well as Jeff Kennedy, partner of Martin Pringle Law Firm. So if the three of you would like to stand, I'd like to thank you at this time. I'd also like to thank our major sponsors, Wildcatter, Palomino Petroleum, and IMA for being a Black Gold sponsor this year. Our gold sponsors, Berexco, LLC, Colt Energy, CVR Refining, My Oil Operations, and Mull Drilling Company. Thank you very much for generously supporting this event. Now, I'm very excited to hear our guest speaker today, Robert Grenier, and he will be introduced by Ed.
Thank you. I, too, am looking forward to Mr. Grenier's talk. Robert Grenier is a highly decorated 27-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency's clandestine service and renowned expert on the Middle East, South Asia, and counterterrorism. Mr. Grenier played a central leadership role in the greatest national security challenges of his time. When 9/11 struck, he was the CIA Overseas Chief of Station for Pakistan and Afghanistan. After preparing the original war plan for U.S. military operations in Afghanistan, approved by President George W. Bush on September the 21st of 2000, or September 24th of 2001, Mr. Grenier went on to organize and direct the joint CIA Special Forces teams, which combined with Afghan militias to drive out the Taliban and al-Qaeda from the southern Afghanistan. Later, as the U.S. prepared to invade Iraq, Mr. Grenier was brought back to Washington and named the CIA Iraq Mission Manager, responsible for all CIA intelligence operations and analysis in that country, and representing CIA in all White House policy deliberations on Iraq for a 2.5-year period. In the final 2 years of his CIA career, Mr. Grenier was director of the CIA Counterterrorism Center, responsible for all CIA counterterrorism operations around the globe. In 2006, he retired from CIA and went on to private sector. Earlier, Mr. Grenier was Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and South Asia and a Special Assistant to the Undersecretary of State. He conceived and organized the CIA's Counter-Proliferation Division, serving as its first Chief of Operation. He also headed the FARM, that is CIA's basic training facility, where he authored the Clandestine Services Code of Ethics. Since leaving government, Mr. Grenier has become a recognized expert in global risk management, serving for 3 years as chairman for global security consulting at Kroll Incorporated. He is currently chairman of ERG Partners, an investment bank providing financial advisory services for firms in the intelligence and security sector. While pursuing a business career, Mr. Grenier has appeared widely in both U.S. and international media, including many appearances on ABC, NBC, CBS, including 60 Minutes, CNN, Fox, PBS, including Frontline, Nat Geo, History Channel, Smithsonian, NPR, BBC, VOA, CBC, and Al Jazeera English, and many others. He's also been interviewed in literally dozens of leading print publications around the world. In addition, Mr. Grenier has been a featured speaker in the U.S., the Middle East, and India. He's written over 90 op-eds for Al Jazeera English, for whom he has also been an on-air political commentator. His book, 88 Days to Kandahar, a CIA Diary, was published by Simon & Schuster in January 2015. Mr. Grenier received an A.B. in philosophy from Dartmouth College and later did graduate studies in foreign affairs at the University of Virginia. He serves on several boards, including the CIA Officers Memorial Foundation, which educates the children of CIA officers killed in the line of duty. He is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and when not sailing, he resides with his family in the Washington, D.C. area. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Grenier.
I think so. Can you all hear me? Is this thing working? Excellent. There we go. Well, listen, Ed, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I didn't think you were going to use the whole thing. You know? Frankly, I'm a little bit surprised that people haven't fallen off into a deep coma after listening to all that. But I really appreciate this invitation to speak here today. And having spent as much time in the Middle East as I have, as you can imagine, I've spent a lot of time with people in the oil patch. I've always liked oil and gas people. I don't get a chance to spend very much time with them these days, and so I particularly appreciate the opportunity to rub shoulders with you here today. Now, I think it was several weeks ago that I was on the phone with Marjorie and Nick and a few other people here from KIOGA, and I think I agreed that I would try to explain to everyone what's happening in the Middle East and why. Yes, it's that ominous. What was I thinking? It's like so many other decisions I've made in my life. It seemed like a good idea at the time. But I got to tell you, you look at what's happening in the Middle East right now, and you're just overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. There are wars in Libya, Yemen, Iraq, Syria. The greatest humanitarian catastrophe that we've seen since World War II, literally millions of refugees flowing across borders. We're seeing community against community, Sunni against Shia. I started out my career in 1979 as a junior intelligence officer in the deserts of North Africa, and I've been following the region closely ever since, and I have never seen anything like this. I don't know how far back in history you have to go to find anything that approaches what we're seeing in the Middle East right now. Maybe back to the original Muslim conquest in the 7th century. So to begin to get your arms around what's happening in the Middle East right now, it seems to me you have to take a couple of steps back. And in my view, you have to think about three primary issues, three primary drivers of what's happening in the Middle East now and into the future. And the first of those is the aftermath of the so-called Arab Spring. The second is the rise of ISIS, no real surprise there. And the third is the Sunni-Shiite divide. Those are the three big factors all working together that are driving events in the Middle East right now. So first, the Arab Spring. You know, people talk a lot about intelligence failures, and yeah, there have been a few. I try not to get defensive about it. I do. But you know, when you think about intelligence, you have to make a distinction between a secret and a mystery. A secret is something that somebody somewhere actually knows. It can be written down on a piece of paper, locked in a safe. It can be found in a computer somewhere. It's something that a spy can steal. And if the spies fail to do that, then that's an intelligence failure. But there are other things that happen that frankly are just mysteries. And I believe that how and why the Arab Spring happened when it did is an abiding mystery. Now, mind you, we could see it coming. I predicted it years before. By the early 1990s, I was convinced that there was going to be something like the Arab Spring. Now, I'll admit that predicting 20 years in advance that something is going to happen and it could happen any minute is a little bit less than useful. I'll admit that. But you could see this building, you could see this coming. For years, you could see that this was a region, the vast majority of which was being ruled by unrepresentative, wealthy, highly repressive elites who did not reflect the people that they were ruling over and who were ruling for their own benefit. And at the same time, you had a demographic explosion that was taking place in the region. An exploding population, huge increase in young people, many of whom were unemployed, inadequate education, inadequate water, inadequate infrastructure of all kinds, and no political outlet, no legitimate means of expressing their grievances. I mean, that's like a pressure cooker. That is unsustainable. You know that sooner or later that has to explode. And yet, year after year, decade after decade, the Middle East just kept muddling along with pretty much the same slate of leaders. Until suddenly, in December of 2010, a young man by the name of Mohammed Bouazizi, off in some small village somewhere in Tunisia, with no job prospects, decides that he's going to try to support himself and his family by becoming a street peddler. And he goes out on the street with fruits and vegetables, and the police set on him right away, and they say, "You don't have a license." And they confiscate his goods, they publicly humiliate him, and he is so angry, he is so frustrated that he lights himself on fire. Now, this could easily have been an obscure event that nobody outside that immediate vicinity would ever have known. But in this day and age, social media being what it is, this thing gets captured on the internet, and it goes viral. And literally within weeks of this man lighting himself on fire, half of the Middle East is in flames. It triggers a revolution not only in Tunisia, but then in Libya, and in Egypt, and in Yemen, in Bahrain, in Syria, and all the rest of the leaders of the Middle East are wondering if they're going to be next. Absolutely extraordinary thing. And we're still dealing with the consequences as they roll forward. The second is the rise of ISIS. And it's linked to the aftermath of the Arab Spring because ISIS has thrived on ungoverned territory. And the Arab Spring has generated a lot of ungoverned territory. Now, it started with an individual by the name of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Now, he was one of these extremists, international extremists, who went into Iraq to participate in the uprising, in the insurgency against the U.S. military occupation. He did rather well. Established an Islamic extremist organization, got a lot of foreign fighters to follow him. And ultimately, he decided to call his organization Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Now, he didn't have a whole lot to do with Al-Qaeda. He certainly wasn't about to follow the orders of Osama bin Laden or Ayman al-Zawahiri. But he liked the brand, and so he wrapped himself in the Al-Qaeda brand, and eventually he became the face of the insurgency. But the fact is that his organization, his movement, if you will, failed. They were defeated. Zarqawi himself was killed in a U.S. airstrike in 2007, and fairly shortly thereafter, as part of the U.S. surge in Iraq, and primarily because of the so-called Arab Awakening, when Sunni militias in western Iraq allied themselves with the U.S. military to defeat these extremists and drive them out of their areas, they were essentially defeated. But in 2011, a very important thing happened. The last of 10,000 U.S. troops departed Iraq by the end of that year. And their importance really wasn't military. I mean, you can't do a whole lot with only 10,000 troops. Their importance was political. Because when the last of the U.S. troops departed Iraq, we lost our political influence with the prime minister there. And without the influence of the U.S. military and the U.S. ambassador, Nouri al-Maliki, the Iraqi prime minister, started to do what came natural to him, and that was to suppress the Sunnis. And within a very short time, the Sunnis, under the repression of this Shiite-led government, turned policy once again, and now they once again allied themselves with the extremists to make common cause against this government that was repressing them in Baghdad. And at the same time, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring in Syria, when there was complete political chaos there, these extremists fled, or rather flew across the border, and they managed to conquer all of eastern Syria. It wasn't that hard. It's a very small population in eastern Syria. It's mostly desert. But from that location that they were able to control, they were then able to attract literally thousands of extremists from all around the world and to establish a financial base for themselves. And with that base, they were then able to reinvade Iraq. And with the help of the Sunni community, again, that was disenfranchised by the government in Baghdad, they were able to conquer a third of that country. And in June of 2014, they actually conquered Mosul, the third largest city in Iraq. It was the high water mark for them. And with Islamic extremism, like so many other things in life, nothing succeeds like success. And so in a short time, you saw other groups of extremists also occupying ungoverned space, who instead of wrapping themselves in the mantle of Al-Qaeda, now wrap themselves in the mantle of ISIS. We saw them spring up in Libya, in Yemen, and as far afield as Afghanistan and Pakistan. Thirdly, the Sunni-Shiite divide. Well, there's nothing new about the Sunni-Shiite divide. It's been with us since the 8th century. And anybody who spent time in the Middle East knows about the lingering endemic distrust between the Sunni and the Shia. There's no real surprise there, but it's become much, much more acute in recent years. And as we look at it in retrospect, there are a few key events. And one of them that we didn't fully appreciate at the time was the execution of Saddam Hussein. Now, here was Saddam Hussein, the leader of a Sunni minority in Iraq. And that Sunni minority had ruled since time immemorial in that country. And now, all of a sudden, in the aftermath of the U.S. invasion, it's a Shiite-led government in Iraq. And they execute Saddam Hussein in 2006. And we didn't fully appreciate it at the time, but you talk to Sunnis all around the region, particularly in Syria, and that came as a shock. To them, it was a symbol of a shift in power in the region. And it came as Iran was beginning to feel its oats, was beginning to project power outside of itself in a way that it hadn't previously been able to do. It grew further as a result of, again, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and Al-Qaeda in Iraq and later ISIS, because their tactic was to attack the Shia with the express purpose of getting the Shia to attack the Sunnis, in turn to motivate the Sunnis to bind themselves more closely with the extremists in ISIS and elsewhere, giving further currency to the Shiite-Sunni divide. If you want to understand how it works in the Middle East, all you have to do right now is to look at Saudi Arabia. Look at the world as it appears from Riyadh. They see Iran. It's coming out from under international sanctions, ready to project power elsewhere in the neighborhood. They know that for years, the Iranians have tried to foment dissent among the Shiite minority inside Saudi Arabia, which happens to be co-located with the eastern oil fields, by the way. And then they look a little bit further west to Iraq, where now you have a Shiite-led government which holds the whip hand and, by the way, is allied with the Iranians. And then you look a little bit further west and you see the Iranians and Hezbollah supporting Bashar Assad against a Sunni-led insurgency. And you look a little further west still and you see that the greatest power in Lebanon is Hezbollah, again allied with Iran. And then in January of 2015, you have the Houthi Shias in Yemen, small group inside Yemen that then leads a rebellion against the government in Sana'a. And the Saudis are beside themselves. They feel that they're being surrounded by Shia. Now, I'll be the first to say that they're over-interpreting this. They are over-evaluating the threat to themselves from Iran and from the Shia. But that's not the way they see it. And it's not just the elites, it's the man on the street. They see a Shiite under every rock, and they feel that they are under pressure. So those are the three factors that are driving events right now in the Middle East, and they all come together most acutely in Syria. Now, as we look at what's happening in Syria right now, and we look at it from a foreign policy perspective, I can tell you this is the most intractable foreign policy situation I have ever seen in my career, in fact, that I can even imagine. And one of the things that's driving the complexity and the difficulty of all this is that our friends and our allies, so-called, are actually every bit as problematic to us as our enemies. We look at what's happening in Syria right now, and our priority is very clear. We're focused like a laser beam on ISIS. Whatever else is happening in Syria, it's ISIS that poses the potential threat to us, and we're focused on them. Unfortunately, the people who are most naturally allied with us don't see it that way at all. The Saudis, Qataris, and the other Persian Gulf Arabs, they ought to be focused on ISIS. ISIS poses a greater threat to them than it ever will be, than it ever will to us. And yet they are obsessed with this Sunni-Shiite rivalry, and all they can see is Bashar Assad. Yeah, they're concerned about ISIS, but they are focused on overthrowing Bashar Assad. That's what they want to accomplish. And the same with the Turks. For somewhat different reasons, they have a megalomaniac who's their president right now, sees everything in personal terms, and he just hates Bashar Assad. He feels that he was personally betrayed by Bashar Assad, wants to see him overthrown. And so rather than isolating the extremists, both in ISIS and elsewhere in Syria, that we think they ought to be focused on, instead they are providing support to a number of these extremist groups. Why? Because they are fighting against the Bashar Assad government. Now, we don't particularly like Bashar Assad either, and this administration has made it very clear for years now that Bashar Assad must go. But there's a little problem there. There's a basic ambivalence at the heart of our policy, because what we're saying in effect is, yeah, Bashar Assad must go, but not right now, and not all at once. Because there are two very inconvenient facts at work here. The first is that the opposition to Bashar Assad is dominated by Islamic extremists who frankly are every bit as dangerous in the long run as ISIS itself. Now, most of the oppositionists to the Bashar Assad regime are secularists. A majority of them are. They ought to be our natural allies. The problem is that they're just not very effective. They're completely disorganized. They can't make common cause. They can't sustain a common military effort against the regime on their own, and they rely very much on the extremists. They're far better organized, they're far better fighters, and they are the ones that actually are the glue that's holding the opposition together. And we dare not support them. Now, we're trying to support some elements in the sectarian, or rather in the in the non-extremist opposition. But we've been very, very careful about doing that because we're afraid that the aid that we give them is going to flow to the extremists. And we dare not allow the extremists to win. The other inconvenient fact is that you got to make a distinction between the regime, Bashar al-Assad, his family, and his closest henchmen, and the structure of the state of Syria itself. Now, we want to eliminate the regime without eliminating the state structure, because if the state structure collapses, all hell breaks loose. If we think we have a humanitarian disaster in Syria right now, and we do, it will become immeasurably worse if the state collapses. Because the first order of business for the Islamic extremists, both in ISIS and in the opposition, is going to be to sort out these Alawites. We're going to have a bloodbath on our hands. And there'll be no way, there'll be no basis upon which to launch an attack against the extremists in the opposition, and particularly against ISIS. It would be an absolute disaster, and we recognize that. And so what the administration wants to do is basically to have it both ways. We're saying Assad must go, but not right now. What we need to have is a negotiated solution that will allow Assad to stay for an interim period, and then remove him, replace him with another regime that will then be able to reach out to the secular elements in the opposition and make common cause with them to sort out the extremists both in the opposition and in ISIS. Good plan. Unfortunately, it's just not going to happen that way. And we expect the Russians to help us do it because they have a great deal more influence with the Syrian regime, certainly, than we do. And while they are sort of giving us the rope-a-dope and they're pretending to cooperate with us in certain areas, at the end of the day, they're just not going to do it. Because what the Russians are saying is, look, okay, fine, good idea. You want to replace Bashar al-Assad. Show us who's going to do it. Where is he? If you can find him, we'll support him. And we have no answer. And so instead what the Russians are doing, despite what they're saying, is they're giving unequivocal support to the Bashar al-Assad regime. And I can tell you that Vladimir Putin is not staying up awake at night worrying about civilian casualties in Syria. He's not worried about the hospitals that are being systematically bombed by his Air Force and the Syrians as well. He's just not worried about it. He's willing to do whatever it takes to see this regime survive. And in the end, I believe they will survive. I don't think they're going to win. They don't have the strength to do that, but I believe that they will survive. And I think that the best that we can hope for in the near term is a series of local ceasefires between the government and groups of oppositionists where basically the regime says, okay, we want to attack you if you don't attack us. And then, ultimately, I think we're going to end up, whether we like it or not, making common cause with this hated Syrian government against ISIS. Am I depressing anybody? I didn't mean for this to be such a downer. But you know, we've spent some time now talking about the what and the why of what's happening in the Middle East. Well, let's take a couple of minutes and talk a little bit about the so what. What does this mean for American interests in the Middle East, apart from everything else that's happening? Well, traditionally, as we all know, the core American interest in the Middle East has been access to oil and gas. Just a fact. Yeah, we've been concerned about security of Israel, but when it comes right down to it, it's access to oil and gas. You know, I laugh. I remember people criticizing the U.S. involvement in the first Gulf War, and they said, well, you're fighting this war just for oil. My answer to that is, yeah. Just for oil, you say. God, who cares about that? Yeah, it's been all about oil and gas in the Middle East, and it still is. But what we're discovering now in recent years is that there are other exports from the Middle East that we also have to be concerned about. One of them is refugees, and the other is terrorism. Syria has generated 5 million refugees across its borders. Another 2 million people have been internally displaced within Syria. We've had 1 million refugees wash up in Europe, and it appears now, at least, because of an agreement between the EU and Turkey, that flow has been staunched. It's not clear that that agreement is going to hold. I think that it will, but at least that appears to be staunched for the time being. And in any case, it's primarily a European problem. Terrorism, that's something else again. We're concerned about terrorism. And when we look at terrorism, it seems to me that there are two primary things that we have to look at. Most counterterrorism, I spent a lot of my life doing counterterrorism. Most counterterrorism, actually, truth be told, is international police work. They're extremists who participate in the global jihad. They travel from country to country. Information about them is shared between ourselves and our allies and other allied security and intelligence services all around the world. That then generates their internal investigations. They share that information back with us, and ultimately, these extremists are captured or killed. It actually works quite well, and there's literally a global infrastructure that has grown up since 9/11, which does that job pretty well. Where we have a problem is when we have ungoverned space. And that's what we have in Iraq, that's what we have in Syria, that's what we have in Libya, Yemen, a number of other countries around the area. That's a huge problem, and it's not a problem that we can solve on our own, not unless we're going to take a 500,000-man army and try to occupy all of these areas ourselves. I just don't think that's going to happen. I don't think you're going to get support from the American people to do that, and it wouldn't be wise even if they would. What we need to do is to make common cause with elements on the ground, whether they're nation states or subnational elements, to empower them, to work with them, to help them to do over the long term what we can't do ourselves. That's what we're doing slowly in Iraq. It's what we're doing much more slowly in Syria. Right now, as we speak, CIA operatives and special forces are working with militias from a place called Misrata in Libya, which is closing in on the last redoubt of ISIS, in a place called Sirte on the coast in Libya. That's the way forward. It's difficult, it's frustrating, that's the way forward, and we're actually making a certain amount of progress. So, that leaves oil and gas. Well, it's a little bit counterintuitive, given all that we've described about what's happening in the Middle East right now, but Middle East oil and gas production is at an all-time high. You all know that. In Iraq, they've recovered from the down period under Saddam. They're producing, 4.4 million barrels a day now. Iran is coming out from under sanctions. They're producing somewhere close to 4 million barrels a day. The Saudi Arabians are much more focused now, as always, on maintaining their market share rather than supporting price. They're producing, 10 million barrels a day? It appears that oil and gas supplies from the Middle East, in spite of all of the chaos, is actually quite secure, and I expect that to persist. Now, I promised on that phone call I mentioned a few minutes ago that I'd also say a little bit about Saudi Arabia, because I know people here are concerned about it, as we all should be. Stability in Saudi Arabia is extremely important. Why? Access to oil and gas. And they are stable right now. I expect them to be stable, at least for the foreseeable future, but there are clouds on the horizon. The torch is in the process of being passed from the old generation, the sons of King Abdulaziz, to the next generation in Saudi Arabia. Old King Salman bin Abdulaziz has established someone from the next generation, Mohammed bin Nayef, as the crown prince, and he's set up his own son as the deputy crown prince. Now, this young man is the second in succession, but he has a great deal of power. He is the oldest son of Salman's third and favorite wife, which is all the credential he needs. Thank you very much. But he is a very smart, aggressive, ambitious young man. Maybe a little bit too aggressive. He's the one that led Saudi Arabia into what I regard as an ill-advised foray into Yemen. It hasn't turned out quite as badly as I anticipated, but it's not pretty, and they may have difficulty extracting themselves, and others in the leadership have not failed to notice this. He has a very aggressive plan to modernize Saudi Arabia economically and socially. God bless him. I don't think it's going to work in quite the way that he intends. And in the meantime, he's stepping on the toes of a lot of people in the royal family. And we're seeing dissension build within the royal family to a level that I haven't seen, or I'm not aware of, since the early 1960s. Now, is the royal family going to fall apart? Are we going to see a dissolution in Saudi Arabia? Certainly not in the near term, and probably not in the immediate term. And even if there is political instability in Saudi Arabia, it's not entirely clear that that's necessarily going to affect oil and gas flows, but it may. Again, not something for us to worry about right now, not with everything else we have to worry about, but something that we need to follow. So, on that slightly more optimistic note, I'm trying, let's open up the floor to questions. Yes, sir. I think that there's a microphone, I guess, that you all can use.
Thank you. We heard this morning that some of the problem is trying to figure out how to change culture. And after thousands of years, is there any hope or chance that the Arab world is going to try and figure out how to live together?
Did you all hear the question? Is there any hope of some sort of a cultural change in the Middle East that will allow the Arabs and the Persians and the others to live with one another? And I think the short answer to that is no. And I don't say that glibly, and I actually say that reluctantly. And I have to admit, it seems naive right now, I was actually very hopeful at the start of the Arab Spring. I really was. I thought, you know, good on them that they're driving out these old and corrupt regimes, and I really thought that we were going to have an opportunity for some sort, at least at the start, of a democratic opening. And in fact, they've made some progress in terms of establishing a viable democratic process in Little Tunisia, but elsewhere it hasn't worked that way. And what we're seeing, once again, is a return to repression. That's what we're seeing in Egypt, where Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has set himself up as the new Mubarak, except he's even more repressive than Mubarak ever was. In Turkey, I'm really disappointed about this. I mean, here what we have is essentially a Muslim Brotherhood government in Turkey. And they, I think, have been a model for the region. That, yes, in fact, there are Islamists, these are not extremists, but these are Islamists who actually are leading a democratic system. Well, what we're seeing right now under Erdogan is a cult of personality. He's crushing dissent. And he's demonstrating what we've seen, frankly, so many other times. Even those people who are interested in the Middle East in something called democracy, their idea of democracy is very, very simple. Basically, it means if we win the election, we can do whatever we damn want. That is not a prescription for long-term stability. As I'm afraid we're going to see, we just saw in Turkey there was an attempted military coup. I think we're going to see it all over again in Egypt. And so I think the best that we can hope for, quite frankly, is another round of repression, which we hope is going to last long enough to provide us with allies against whom we can work against the Islamic extremists. But I'm afraid that it's going to be back to the future, and history is going to repeat itself all over again. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Will Iran get a nuclear bomb? And two, what do you foresee, in your best estimation, Israel's involvement in this tinderbox?
Okay, so the question is, do I think Iran is going to get a nuclear weapon? And how do I see Israel working in all of this? Yeah, I hope the answer to the first question is no. I know that this nuclear agreement with Iran is a very, very controversial one. And I think it really comes down to two ways of looking at this. If you listen to Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, what he has said, and what others in this country as well have said, is that we must keep Iran from having the capacity, the capability to build a nuclear weapon. Problem is that horse has already left the barn. The capacity to create nuclear weapons is up here. They have the intellectual capacity to build a nuclear weapon. They have the industrial infrastructure to build a nuclear weapon. And the key element then is to get fissile material. What this agreement does is it keeps them from developing fissile material under circumstances which, if they decide to change their policy, at least there'll be a tripwire, and at least we'll know, and then we can potentially take action in time before they get a nuclear weapon. Frankly, I think it's the best that we can hope for. It's not ideal, but that's what we've come up with. And in spite of all of the rhetoric to the contrary, I think it's the best that we can do. With regard to Israel, you know, it's kind of interesting. In a way, Israel, I mean, for those of us, you know, who grew up in the Middle East, I mean, it's always been the center of animus. It's been the one thing that Arabs and others in the Islamic world could agree upon, opposition to Israel. But in fact, they've almost become an afterthought now. There's so much that's happening within the Middle East that has absolutely nothing to do with the Israelis. The rise of ISIS, this whole tendency, the global jihad, you know, this movement, this Islamic extremist movement. While, yeah, they pay lip service to Israel, they're really not primarily focused on Israel. They're focused on these other Arab regimes that they want to overthrow. So in a way, you can say that, yes, obviously a grossly unstable Middle East is not good for Israel, but in fact, they are really not being directly threatened by what's going on right now. You can understand why they'd be uncomfortable with it. I would in the same place, but they're really not being directly threatened, and I see them as being viable. At the end of the day, they have a qualitative military advantage over any single or any combination of potential adversaries in the Middle East, and at the end of the day, that's really what counts. Yes?
What's your view on the coming development of the natural gas field that Israel is developing off the Mediterranean coast, and how that'll impact the economic, political situation in the Middle East?
Yeah, unfortunately, I do not know a whole lot about that. You're not going to find a whole lot of wisdom from me on that. The question, for those of you who might have missed it, is this big offshore gas field in the Mediterranean off the Israeli coast. Can anybody help me here? How much gas are we talking about? Trillions of cubic feet. How is that going to affect the power equation in the region? I don't think. I mean, obviously, gas, like oil, is a fungible commodity, and so if you have a big increase in supply in one place, it's going to affect the global market. But I think that there are still advantages that, for instance, the Iranians have in servicing their customers, such that this is probably not going to make a huge impact on them. So if we're hoping that it's going to strengthen our friends, weaken our enemies, yeah, it may have some of that impact. But my initial reaction, not knowing a whole lot about it, is that that's probably going to be fairly limited. Was it a mistake to take out Saddam Hussein? If you ask my wife, the answer is yes. I got to tell you, as Ed mentioned during that introduction, right after what we thought was the war in Afghanistan, we thought we'd won it, by the way, by 2002. And as we anticipated invading Iraq, I was brought back to head up the CIA part of that effort. And so I was working 18-hour days, and I'd come home at the end of the day absolutely exhausted, and then my wife would start working on me. She'd say, "What are you thinking? This is not going to turn out well. You think you're going to overthrow Saddam Hussein, blah, 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 blah." Well, we could spend a long time talking about this. I actually supported the effort to overthrow him. What we don't know is what might have happened had he remained in place. And yeah, it was all about weapons of mass destruction, but the reason that we were concerned about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was that a Saddam Hussein, having shown in the past that he was willing to invade his neighbors, came very close in the context of the first Gulf War to being able to dominate the region, essentially to call the tune to the countries that are producing a majority of the world's traded oil. Does that seem like a potentially damaging concentration of power? It does to me. And so the concern of having Saddam Hussein with nuclear weapons is that he would then be in a position where he could either Finlandize or directly control the Arab-Persian Gulf and therefore a majority of the world's traded oil. That was something that I believe was intolerable. He may have been able to accomplish that eventually had we simply allowed nature to take its course. We all knew that eventually he was going to come out from under UN sanctions. Our supposed allies in Europe and elsewhere, the Russians, the French, were eager to do business with him. And as soon as he was out from under sanctions, there was no question in my mind that he and his sons were going to set about trying to recreate the weapons of mass destruction that they did have and that were disassembled by the UN inspections. So now, all that said, would we arguably be better off right now if we still had a strong man in power in Baghdad? Whatever else you want to say about Saddam Hussein, Islamic extremism was not a problem there when he was in power. And that is certainly true. What we don't know is what might have happened had history taken a different turn. Yes, sir.
I don't know if they can hear me or not, but and you can repeat the question.
Okay.
So one of the reasons that oil prices are not falling further is because of the loss of production in Libya. Huge loss of production. What are their prospects for Libya actually being able to bring their production back online?
Yeah, the question was with what's happening in Libya right now. There's been a huge decline in Libyan oil production. It's one of the reasons why oil prices have declined as far as they have. As we all know, the global oil price is determined on the margins. You reduce a little bit on the margin, and it has a huge effect on the entire market. Yeah, and I know Libyan production has been bouncing around. It's like only like maybe 300,000 barrels a day right now, or something like that.
Down 1 million plus barrels a day.
Yeah.
That would have a huge effect on the market.
Yeah,
back online.
so if you had if 1 million plus barrels a day come back online from Libya, obviously it would have a substantial impact on the market. Well, I guess you could say that the problem in Libya right now is too much democracy. Instead of having one national government, they've got three. And nobody can agree on who ought to control the oil infrastructure. And in fact, in essence, you've got a fourth government, a facilities protection militia that is actually able to control a majority of the oil infrastructure. So I think that the short answer is we are not going to see full-out production on the part of the Libyans for some time to come. That said, it is a very dynamic situation. There is the third government, the so-called GNA, which has essentially been cobbled together by the UN. It has virtually no authority, but it does have a lot of foreign support. I don't think they're going to be the solution to the problem there. But I have been dealing with folks in Libya in recent months, and there is a growing realization that something has to be done. Yes, they're highly divided. They're frankly not fighting with each other all that much. Most of the fighting that's taking place right now is inserted against the members of ISIS. And I would not be terribly surprised in the next year or so if we see enough political stability where even if they don't have a unified national government, they're able to come together on some sort of a convention that will allow the oil to be produced and to be distributed in some way. But it's not going to happen tomorrow, I can tell you right now. And the political divisions there and the distrust is very, very deep. So again, it's not a situation like we have in Syria. I mean, I can't conceive of how Syria can ever be put back together again. It's a whole lot more benign than that in Libya. But if your bet is that Libyan oil is going to remain low for the next year, I think you're probably safe. Sir?
What are the most significant political, military, or terrorist risks to the Saudi oil fields or the Saudi oil infrastructure?
What are the most political, most difficult?
What are the most significant political, military, or terrorist risks to the Saudi oil infrastructure and Saudi oil fields?
Yeah. Okay. So what's the political, military, or terrorist risk to the Saudi oil fields, and how serious is that? Well, I think right now, with as many things as we have to worry about in the Middle East, that ranks pretty low on the scale. There's no outside power that is going to try to do what Saddam Hussein did in 1990. His big mistake, by the way, when he invaded Kuwait was that he didn't continue on down the highway to the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, which he easily could have done at the time. And then what would we have done? You have Saddam Hussein sitting on the eastern Saudi oil fields and has them all wired for explosion. That's not a situation I would have liked to contemplate, something he could easily have done. Well, there's no modern day Saddam Hussein in Iran or anywhere else that's able to do something like that. So that sort of military risk to the Saudi oil fields, I think that we can discount. Now, there's always a potential for terrorism risk. I'm trying to think, how far back was this? This would have been like maybe 2007, 2008. I remember there was an attempted terrorist strike against Abqaiq, and that's where the big oil stabilizers are in Abqaiq and Saudi Arabia. You take the oil stabilizers out, that creates a huge problem. Well, I can tell you, I used to be the petroleum officer in Saudi Arabia, and we were looking at the Abqaiq stabilizers and what would happen there. And there are things you can do. You can run the oil through spheroids. You can get the pressure down enough, get enough of the hydrogen sulfide out of the gas, and you can still export it. One of the things that we all know the Saudis did back as a result of the Iran-Iraq war was that they built a number of alternative means of exporting oil aside from the Persian Gulf. Now, if they were to lose their single-point mooring buoys in the Persian Gulf, that would not be a good thing. They can't completely compensate for that, but there are other means of getting a substantial quantity of oil out, and cutting off oil export from the Persian Gulf would be very, very difficult. I mean, the Straits of Hormuz, people talk about the choke point. Well, it'd be really hard to close, particularly when you've got the U.S. Fifth Fleet there. So anyway, I think it's a long way of saying that on the range of things to stay up worrying about at night, I think that's pretty low on the scale. Okay. Are we down to maybe a last question? Okay. Yeah, the question is, how long are we going to have to stay in the Middle East if, as we said before, it's all about oil and gas, and with all of the technological innovations that you and others have made here in this country that have put us on the verge, at least, of energy independence, how long are we going to have to stay in the Middle East and take the risks associated with all of that? Well, I guess the way I would look at it is we're probably going to stay in some way in the Middle East indefinitely. Yeah, the oil markets look pretty good right now, but if you look out decades ahead, I think we're still going to have some reliance probably on Middle East oil and gas, unless somebody finds a cheap way to make hydrogen. So I foresee that need to be there, but what I would really stress, and what I think is absolutely true right now, is that we don't need to be there in a big way. We don't need to have large U.S. military forces there. I think that we need to be engaged. I think that we need to be postured to do the kinds of things, frankly, that we're doing right now, and trying to bring about the sorts of results that we're trying to achieve, for instance, in Iraq against ISIS, with very small numbers of troops, disproportionately special forces, and with preponderant U.S. air power, working with allies on the ground. And what that means is having small, nimble forces that are very well served by intelligence and with air power, and a lot of patience, because none of this that we do when we're trying to work through others is going to be easy. But I think that's the way forward, and I think that we can maintain at least a necessary amount of influence in the Middle East, and we can do it in a sustainable way and with a fairly minimal military footprint. Thank you all very much, and I would be remiss if I didn't just leave you with one final thought. I was listening a little bit earlier to some of the things that Ed had to say, and as I mentioned, I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I've spent a lot of time with oil and gas people. I've done some consulting for gas companies, or rather oil companies, since I got out of government, and as I look at it as an outsider, it seems to me that you are getting some somewhat conflicting messages. On the one hand, you're being told that you're producing a dirty product which is fouling the atmosphere, creating global warming, and you should all be ashamed. On the other hand, you better produce as much of it as you possibly can and keep the prices low. Sounds a little confusing maybe to me. Well, let me tell you, I think the vast majority of Americans understand that energy is central to everything that we have in this country. We are reliant on hydrocarbons now. We're going to be reliant on hydrocarbons for the foreseeable future. And so speaking personally, I just want to thank all of you for what you do for our country and for our economy. Thank you very much.
Mr. Grenier, we'd like to give you a token of our appreciation for coming today, and thank you for your talk. Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. Okay, that was very good. We do have our seminar starting in about 15 minutes or something. Over here, we have 2 seminars, maybe. Now, our speaker on our pipeline safety from the IPAA, unfortunately, she became ill and was not able to make it here. So she sent me the PowerPoint slides. So if anybody's interested in seeing that, you'll see the slides the first time when I see them, too. So. Otherwise, we do have another good panel over here that's going to talk about some of the things in the oil field for cutting expenses and stuff. But we'll have both of those over there in just a minute. Was there any other announcements, Nick or Marjorie? No? Okay, then we're adjourned. Thank you.